makes you so sick at heart that you can't take part. You can't even passively take part.
So economist Jeffrey Sachs went on BBC Newsnight and he went full on Chad. Like, I'm talking beast mode in ways that you rarely see an economist speak in public. Before I show this clip, I'm going to tell you a bit about who Jeffrey Sachs is, which you may or may not have heard of. He is probably one of the most famous, probably top 10 most famous living economists right now. And not all that fame has been positive fame. Became notorious for being one of the architects of so-called shock therapy. Shock therapy was the belief in the early 1990s that economies that were transitioning from sort of pre-market type systems like the former Soviet Union, the former communist bloc, many other Latin American economies as well, moving from this kind of non-market system to a market system. And according to the apostles of shock therapy, this had to be done sort of immediately, like liberalize everything. No time for gradualism. You had to adopt all these free market policies as quick as possible. And yes, there would be pain, but in the end, markets would eventually adjust and countries would grow again. This was, of course, a very controversial policy. First and foremost, because it was generally not applied democratically. People didn't really have a say on whether they wanted shock therapy or they just would prefer a more gradualistic move towards a market economy. And in many cases, it led to very severe crises immediately after implementation. So it's true that many countries eventually moved on and began growing, but the immediate implementation of shock therapy was very painful for a lot of countries, and probably no country suffered more than Russia. And Jeffrey Sachs was very heavily criticized at the time for pushing these policies. Here's an article from the New York Times magazine from all the way from 1993, where he's already basically being labeled as the shock therapist. And as the article says, his message of urgency was not universally accepted, and many economists preferred a gradual approach. Here's one quote: "Economic reform is a political process. First, you must build consensus." So that was his first issue that gave him notoriety. But then he became something of an apostle for development aid. And this was during the 90s when, you had the sort of emergence of a neoliberal consensus that sort of blended not just politicians, but economists and rock stars. And this is when you had kind of the efforts of the Davos set to begin moving towards a discourse towards development aid in places like Africa that was also very significantly criticized despite its seemingly good intentions. It was, the record of development aid in the mold that people like Jeffrey Sachs was pursuing isn't really good. And he took a lot of backlash from a lot of more right-wing economists than he was. People like William Easterly, who is also very well known in the development community, and he's mostly kind of a free market guy. So his views on development aid have not been exactly well received in most quarters. And he was also, I guess, maybe not criticized, but maybe mocked or ridiculed for being close to one celebrity who was also very much in this aid ecosystem, which was Bono. And that's I guess, as cringe a photo as you'll see of any high-profile economist, probably ever. Bono wrote the intro to one of Jeffrey Sachs's most famous books, which I think is called The End of Poverty. I don't recall exactly. But then he's sort of moved away from this, thankfully. I'm not saying that economists shouldn't necessarily hang out with celebrities or act like rock stars. I'm just saying that it better be for a better. It better be less cringy than this. He started mostly focusing on climate. He's been working quite closely with the UN, and he's also been very critical of a lot of US foreign policy blunders, like the Iraq War, for example. And I think his work on climate has been much better received, and definitely more positive. I think he's vindicated himself in many ways, I think, and I would definitely say that his outspokenness on political issues right now is probably for the better. And I think he's a good guy, I would say, despite his past, and especially with shock therapy. So just now, even if he's, quote, a good guy, it's rare for economists to really go like full on nuclear when they're interviewed. Economists tend to prefer, especially very high profile economists, tend to try to be, subtle. They don't want to really rock the boat too much. By and large, economists are what one would call centrists, free market centrists, which is a consensus. And they don't really want to rock the boat. They may express concern for social issues, etc., but they struggle really speaking to power and challenging power. So this makes it all the more surprising the way that Jeffrey Sachs behaved on BBC Newsnight last week. And like I said, this is full on Chad. This is beast mode in ways that you rarely see an economist behave. Here we go.
The Biden administration has been strongly critical of China's actions on human rights, but engaging on climate change. Do you see that as a strategy that can actually work?
I'm not sure why BBC started with listing only China's human rights abuses. What about America's human rights abuses? The Iraq War, together with the UK, completely illegal and under false pretenses. The war in Syria, the war in Libya, the continued sanctions against civilian populations in Venezuela and Iran, walking away from the Paris Climate Agreement for the last 4 years, unilateral trade actions that have been deemed illegal by WTO. So one can make anything one wants, but we have really serious human rights violations by the United States abroad, not to mention an insurrection on January 6th in our own country, not to mention the continued massive racism, white supremacism, and abuse of incarceration of hundreds of thousands of people in the U.S., Black, African-American, people of color. So I think that the whole premise of this story is a little bit odd.
No, but sorry, I'm looking. We have to look. If I may, we have to look.
I found the framing of it not what I expected. I thought we were going to talk about climate change, which we should. But I think that the idea that there is one party that is so guilty, how can we talk to them, is just a strange way to address this issue.
Well, hang on. Sorry, Jeffrey. If I could come, Jeffrey. I'm hoping we can have a conversation. I'm hoping we can have a conversation. And if I could just say, I'm using, and what I'm saying back to you here is, we're also using the framing of the Biden administration. We're also talking from the perspective of how Joe Biden himself and those around him have talked about the human rights abuses in China. So
I don't really know what they told Jeffrey Sachs was gonna talk about when they offered him an interview slot here. So it'd be interesting to exactly know what how the BBC originally framed his intervention. But the fact is, he's absolutely right. So the framing of this question is just ridiculous. I mean, if you're bringing in a recognizable face of climate change investigation and climate change economics, why do you need to frame this question in the context of human rights? It seems to me there's a pretty legitimate discussion and debate you can have simply because, well, the US and China are the world's two largest economies. So how are these two countries who geopolitically don't often see eye to eye, who are rivals, and this is, I think, would have been legitimate. I don't think that Jeffrey Sachs would have pushed back if the framing had been geopolitical. How are two rival powers gonna see eye to eye on an issue that impacts the world, like climate? That would have been great framing. But the human rights framing is absolutely ridiculous, coming from a country that is hardly spotless on human rights abuses. And, we can get into a debate of who is worse. Yeah, definitely China treats its own people way worse than the US does. But the US treats many parts of the world much worse than China treats its neighbors. So this is not, I think, the point of this debate, but it's a very, very deceptive framing that automatically paints China as the villain in this story and the US as kind of the squeaky clean enforcer of global human rights, which we all know it's not.
The US always, excuse me for one moment, the US always attacks other countries. It holds itself sacrosanct. It's really outrageous, because I know what goes on in American foreign policy, and I know how abusive it is, and I know what it's like to live in a racist society, which I happen to do, where a significant part of this country is racist, followed a racist president who led an insurrection on the Capitol. And so the framing of this issue is strange. That's what I'm saying.
What, by your own country as well as the rest of the world? I believe
by the government, not by my own country, by the government of my country. So I believe that the two leading polluters absolutely need to clean up their act. This is crucial for the sake of the world. And so, of course, we need to clean up our act, because the United States is emitting 15 tons of CO2 per person in this country, twice what China is emitting per capita. And the two countries together are about 40% of the CO2 emissions in the world, and we are wrecking the climate.
So there you go. That was fulminating. I mean, just so unexpected. And, even if, most economists may have just sort of objected to the framing of the question, but he was clearly passionate about this, and he went all out, pointing out all the sins of the US, maybe even the ones that weren't really relevant to this discussion. But this is the problem when you have media that just doesn't really think critically. And the cop-out that the BBC presenter was using is that, well, this is the framing of the Biden administration. Well, who cares? You're not the spokesperson of the Biden administration. Why are you repeating the framing of the US on an issue that doesn't necessarily have to have a US perspective? Jeffrey Sachs is not a representative of the US government. So why is he being forced to use the framing of the US government? And certainly even more inexcusable that this is the framing chosen by a news organization that has nothing to do with the US, being the BBC. So this is just bad. And 99% of the times when you have this kind of framing by the media, they don't get called out. Whoever they're interviewing generally doesn't bother attacking the framing of the interviewer. And I think that gets them off the hook so often, because you need to challenge. When you are in front of a camera, in front of an audience of people, you don't have to, you're not compelled to just answer their questions. You can attack the questions themselves. And as someone who really likes debating and knows all the sneaky debating tactics, and this is something you'll learn as well if you take media training in any organization, when you can't answer a question, the best way is to flip the question into something that you can answer. So you're never compelled to just answer the questions that you're asked. And right-wingers are often very sneaky at this. They straw man their way out of everything they want. But this was just good. This was a great way in which Jeffrey Sachs just absolutely obliterated his interviewer by pointing out the ridiculous framing of a question. And if you want to talk about human rights abuses, go right ahead, have a debate on this. But if it's about climate change, and if it's about the two most important economies and the two biggest polluters of the world, what the hell does human rights have to do with this? I mean, the number one human right in this discussion is to ensure that generations from now we have a livable planet. And anything that's not focused on that issue is really outside the scope of this debate. So good job, Jeffrey Sachs. Definitely his position as one of the good guys is more justified these days.